Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. There are all sorts of ways that societies restrict people's movement. For example, people can put gates and fences around their homes and communities. Or there are traffic cones that tell us where we can and can't drive, even though sometimes I might accidentally run over them. I'm working on it. But some methods that society uses to restrict the movements of people are far more sinister, far more serious, and, based on distorted beliefs, have no sincere interest in the safety of those people. What I'm thinking of, in this case, are something called slave codes. Slave codes were based on the belief that Black Americans were just an economic investment. They were purposefully designed to condone harming Black Americans and keeping them enslaved. Though some textbooks on slavery and slave codes refer to enslaved people simply as workers, they were not simply workers. They were treated as an underclass, and the legal system perpetuated that underclass status for economic and prejudicial reasons. Learning about slave codes makes all of this profoundly clear. Slave codes were laws and policies developed during the colonial period to restrict the movement and freedoms of Black people. Though they were called slave codes, many times they were applied to free Black people as well. Remember that the distinction between Negro and enslaved was essentially meaningless during this time. The primary reason the slave codes were implemented was to explicitly and legally reinforce the racial hierarchy within the colonies. Slave codes were a method of protecting the investment of white enslavers by restricting the lives of enslaved people in almost every imaginable way. The codes restricted enslaved people's ability to move around or engage in commerce that would make them financially independent. They basically restricted the very opportunities that would allow them to live with even relative freedom. When there were hints of enslaved people questioning their status, or even the possibility of someone planning a revolt, new slave codes were quickly passed to prevent such a thing from happening. Virginia was the first of the 13 colonies to implement large-scale slave codes. Since the United States was not quite the United States yet, each colony had their own version of these codes. At the time, they were not yet even referred to as slave codes, but even without the formal title, their purpose remained the same: to fundamentally restrict the rights of Black Americans, free and enslaved, and to explicitly deny them the rights afforded to white members of society. Let's take a look at an example. In 1662, Virginia passed this statute: whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. After Elizabeth Key's case in 1656, which we talked about last episode, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed this official law. It mandated what's known as partis sequitur ventrum, determining one's enslaved status based on their mother's labor status, as the legal method to determine whether an individual is enslaved or not. Some scholars, such as Jennifer L. Morgan, posit that it was actually Key's freedom suit that drove the Virginia House of Burgesses to create this law in the first place, a law that was also designed to discourage intimate interracial relations between Black and white people in the colonies. Virginia didn't just stop there. In 1705, Virginia passed another law dedicated to regulating the movement and behavior of enslaved people. It was called an Act Concerning Servants and Slaves. This act banned Black people from owning white servants and penalized those who presided over the marriage between a white and Black person. It banned enslaved people from owning weapons. Other laws around the same time banned Black people, regardless of their servitude status, from testifying against whites in court. You might think that in a country where those same colonists would soon be demanding freedom while espousing the importance of liberty and equality for themselves, that those same people would be a bit more, concerned about liberty and equality for everyone. But the truth is, America's promise and America's actions are very often inconsistent. Let's go to the thought bubble. In 1671, Maryland passed a law stating that Even if an enslaved person converted to Christianity, that conversion did not change their servitude status. This was important because of the legal debate around whether Christians could be enslaved. In a place like South Carolina, well, they built a whole society around slave codes. They did it, as they all did, for both economic and societal reasons. These codes banned black people from engaging in any type of trade, did not allow for enslaved folks to travel without notes from their enslaver, banned enslaved black Americans from keeping loud instruments like drums and horns, and gave law enforcement the authority to search enslaved black people and to whip them if they appeared to be engaging in what was deemed disorderly behavior. Many of these codes showed up after slave rebellions, when enslavers were particularly interested in protecting themselves and their property from enslaved people who wanted their freedom. Enslaved codes weren't just in the southern colonies. New York, for example, had their own set of these laws. A 1702 slave code in New York banned people from trading with enslaved people at all. It also prohibited 3 or more enslaved people from meeting together at the same time. From 1703 to 1704, Rhode Island banned the enslaved from being out after 9 o'clock at night unless they had what was deemed a lawful excuse. Pennsylvania, they also had infamous slave codes. Punishment for offenses committed by white and black people could be deeply and even lethally unequal. While a certain offense committed by a white person might result with them being whipped or branded, a black person charged with committing a similar offense might be killed. Thanks, Thought Bubble. White colonists worked overtime to make sure that the law was used to hurt and constrain black Americans, just because of the color of their skin and their place in the American economy. In early colonial history, white indentured servants and enslaved black people actually had somewhat similar positions in society. But as we've seen in this episode, that wouldn't last. Colonial governments created specific laws that would clearly and legally demarcate what rights a white person could have and which rights a black person could have. Or perhaps, more appropriately, which rights they couldn't have. I'm sure that many people look at these laws and are appalled that such things ever passed. But it's important to note that while today such discrimination might not be explicitly stated in the language of the law itself, laws across the country have different implications and are often enforced differently based on someone's race. This impacts jobs and housing and our criminal legal system, our schools. The list goes on. Looking back, it can be hard to stomach that our country ever implemented these horrific slave codes. But it's important to note that, as is the case throughout Black American history, people pushed back against these laws because they knew they were wrong. Later in this series, we're going to learn about the myriad ways that Black people have resisted these injustices over time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is a Complex Lead production. If you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everybody, forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content that you love. Thanks to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible with your continued support.